Boa tarde, sempre é prazer e uma honra, convite para estar no Brasil falando e conhecendo pouco mais todos os êxitos, sucessos na política social
in social policies, and also to talk a little bit about the challenges we have.
Understanding my Portuguese and switch into English. I come in this presentation having had the wonderful chance through my career of observing social protection and labor policy across a broad number of countries and seeing it just a bit more up close in Brazil. So being able to see the comparison and where Brazil stands out is different than some other countries. So of course, first on a day like today, we learned to use the pointer. There we go. There is quite a lot to congratulate. The minister didn't spend a lot of time on Bolsa Família because we all know the story rather well, but one can't but pause to note all of the wonderful successes it has. So I was leafing through the big orange book, you know, the orange book. I'm one of the proud owners of the orange book, courtesy of the minister, looking at the range of impacts it had. And I just wanted to mention two that I find particularly, I think, interesting. One is that the rate of breastfeeding among Bolsa beneficiaries is 9 points higher than among those who are not in the program. I pick that out because it's one of the less discussed results. I pick it out because very few programs have managed to measure it. And I think it speaks to how the combination of income and of the knowledge gained through the contact with the health service have really worked in fundamental ways to change a very deep household behavior in a way that all the science proves will be of benefit to the children. So I think that's one of the signs of final outcomes being moved by this program. And in all of the impact evaluation on conditional cash transfer programs, the ability to actually measure final outcomes is fairly scarce, and the ability to move them is scarcer still. So I like that one result. We're also seeing positive things in terms of reduction in grade repetition and age for grade disparities, which when I first started hearing about Brazilian policy nearly 30 years ago, were just sort of taken as a given. Oh my gosh, we have the highest repetition in Latin America in Brazil, and that has also been changed. So there's all the wonderful results. Personally, I'm the daughter of industrial engineers, so I've heard my whole life about how you make things happen, and so I have equal admiration for the story in Brazil for how capacity has been built gradually, with determination. The last field trip I was on, seeing Bolsa Família and the CRAS in the field, I was really taken aback with how different this feels than 20 years ago in Latin America, where there was sort of, you would never have seen an army of people with an installation, with computers, with a methodology, actually there to deliver benefits to the poor. So I was really admire Brazil for that. And I also want to note the incredible generosity that the government has had in sharing this experience around the world. So I have a factoid here, possibly one of the more interesting in the presentation, that 120 delegations were hosted by Bolsa Família, by MDS, during the year of 2013 to share this experience. That's a lot of people you've been helping indirectly, as well as the direct delegations. I was probably 5 of those myself, but I think that's very important to congratulate. But of course, not stopping here, you went on to put your, oops, oh, I didn't even realize we had people running up the ladder on this presentation. To set yourself the next step policy of Brazil Sem Miséria, which is really a much harder thing to do. So it's fairly easy to give people money, but to actually create conditions so that they can earn their own money, now that's hard. That's not the stuff of one ministry, it's the stuff of a government, and it's not the stuff of one minister or one administration. It really goes on because you have to coordinate many more programs and agencies. You have to get programs that are actually harder to do right, and you have to do it in an economy where all of the big rules about labor, policy, growth, et cetera, are really the final binding constraint. So again, this is a very hard journey. It's one that Brazil is inspiring others on and being accompanied by others. I just came from a workshop last week in Lima on productive inclusion, where many of the countries of Latin America were there, but now increasingly also some from around the world. In this case, we had people from the Philippines and Indonesian conditional cash transfer programs who've also set themselves similar goals. So when I think about what next, I go back to sort of a generalized vision of what social protection policy is like. And it has sort of two parts. So one set is a set of tools that are used in institutional arrangements to deliver a whole range of programs. Now, each of those programs has to work well, but they also have to work well together. So that's sort of the idealized vision. So if we check to see how Brazil is doing against that vision, we can certainly see that over the last years, there's been, well, we could see it if I could make my clicker work, a range of advances on the administrative tools. So the cadastro is perhaps the most famous in these kinds of workshops, but there's actually a range of others. And I think it's important to think, too, about the institutional arrangement. So the work with Caixa, the work with the local governments, with the index of implementation capacity. All of those things, I think, are things that are well known and to be not taken for granted, because many countries are still struggling with these. And if we were having this conference 15 years ago, we might have thought that these were very difficult challenges. Brazil also has a very comprehensive set of policies, so that if you sort of think about what you might have in the range of policies across different objectives and different age groups, Brazil has at least one, usually 4 or 5 programs in each possible cell. So this leads me to the conclusion, which is kind of the title of the presentation, which is that the next frontier is really not about some new thing or some new program. It's really about the next level challenge on the agendas that you're already working on. So some ideas about that. There is some room to upgrade some of the administrative tools. Cadastro is world-renowned. I think it is the single most named thing that when we hear in the World Bank about what South-South learning should be about, Cadastro is, I think, the most named example. But yet we know it's still not quite perfect. We're partnering with some of the subnational governments who are still trying to improve where they know that they need to improve. But more than that, I think there may be ways now that you've gotten to where you've gotten to think about going another level more ambitious on the degree of integration of administrative data and management information systems. So right now you have Cadastro as a targeting tool, but then each program essentially has a separate system. And so it's not quite as easy as it could be to make sure that each family gets each thing it needs and that we know how well that's working. I think there's also the opportunity to start integrating a bit more between the social assistance system and the contributory system, so between the social insurances and the social assistance side of the house. It's also true that success can bring new pressures. So the Cadastro has been so successful that you have now the vote of confidence in it to put ever more money through that system. But that means that the standards for that system have to be increasingly higher. So you have, for example, taken on the challenge of the Busca Activa to try and reduce errors of exclusion. And I think that's a fabulously important thing. And if there's one thing I could get more governments to do by waving a magic wand, it would be that. But at the same time, you've also made much more complex the benefit formula by having now the minimum income guarantee program and by having this large range of benefits going through it. So it may be that you need to complement by raising the game on reducing error and fraud and the errors of inclusion. We know from OECD countries that, of course, no program is completely able to contain these, but the rates vary between 2 and 10% depending on the country, the efforts made, but mostly on the complexity of the benefit eligibility criteria and the benefit formula. And you have raised both of those in recent years with the changes inherent at Brasil Sem Miséria. So it may be that you need to think about that. And also, now that you have a very large set of programs going to households, thinking about, is it a block of benefits that go to one household and not to another, or not to one that's just above, and it's a large block, so it really changes their incomes dramatically? Or is it that you want a green of programs so that a single household over time may benefit from successively fewer programs as they take their ladder out of poverty, and that this will integrate better policy also within society among households that are in slightly different conditions? So thinking how this all fits together, not just for the extreme poor, but for the moderately poor and the vulnerable, and what that feathering of programs is, I think is an important reflection to make. I think the next piece that comes is a much more difficult agenda for monitoring and evaluation. Brazil has done a lot of this, but so far, mostly at the individual program level, which makes sense because that's sort of how the authorizing environment works. But now that you're tying programs together, questions about what kind of synergies do you get when you do this arise. How do you look at the wrong run effects of programs now that have been going on for a while? And we need the multidimensional evaluations, because even though a single instrument, like a cash transfer, can have impacts on very many different things. So on poverty, on health, on education, on many different dimensions of poverty, health, and education, on labor earnings, on employment, et cetera, but also on some of the less tangible things of agency, empowerment, and mental health. And we've now around the world begun where these things are measured to see impacts on very many of them, but almost no country tries to measure them all for one program. And we understand them to be important both for their intrinsic value. It is surely better to have someone with agency and good mental health status than it is without. But these things are also very important for the household's ability to generate income of their own. So this is an agenda that I think is important moving forward. And I've mentioned also the administrative data sets. I'm happy to congratulate that Brazil has actually made some very interesting starts on some of these things. So the new Pedaggia modules for 2014 that will look at how the cadastro is working and the productive inclusion, the Pesquisa Panel de Pobreza that will give you the 9 rounds of interviews in the same households over 3 years to see over time how income and program participation are working. The recent efforts to merge administrative data from Cadastro, Ministries of Health, CAGED, et cetera, and evaluate BOLSA on those grounds, and the newly agreed 80 million Brazil virtual cohort data bank. So there's lots of things going on to face these challenges, but they're not easy challenges, and I think this is a place where you're showing leadership, and I both congratulate you and hope that you can really move ahead with this. But there's also some challenges in the programming front. Moving to the whole productive inclusion agenda brings a whole set of challenges. So if we look at the world experience of conditional cash transfers, pretty much most of the programs around the world, almost all of the programs that have been evaluated around the world, have had a pretty good degree of success. Some more so than others, some in some dimensions more than others, but in general it's a very positive track record. When we get to the kinds of things that it takes to get households really earning their own income, the track record is very much less inspiring. So of all of the active labor market policies, the training, the entrepreneurship, the microcredit, the national employment services, et cetera, that whole range of policies, overall, the world track record is quite mixed. So many, in fact, the majority of those programs don't really show a positive impact. And those that do, it's pretty small. So we learned that it really matters not just to have the program, but to do it absolutely as well as possible. And there's a lot of know-how emerging about that. I picked up one idea here of moving to a management for results framework, because Brazil has the basic administrative data in place that would make that kind of thing possible. And it's proved to be helpful in some of the OECD countries that have moved that direction. But we're also learning from the youth employment literature that it's not just training or in-classroom training that matters. It's linking for the same person the technical training, with soft skills training, with on-the-job work experience through some sort of apprenticeship or pasantía or something like this, and then job placement linked to it afterwards. So it's a whole range of things. Brazil has programs in all of those dimensions, but you don't necessarily link each of those pieces of help to the same individual yet. So I think it's working on increasing those linkages, just as you have within social assistance, to link between social assistance and labor programs, and then between labor programs. So there's lots of things there. And then, of course, all of this stuff happens in the context of the labor market, which, as we know in Brazil, is going to be a little more depressed in the future than it has been in the past, and has the usual debate of issues about minimum wage policy, the costs of being in the formal sector, and et cetera. So there's a lot going on there. I want to move also to a notion that I've talked so far about a fairly, as though it weren't wide enough, everything in Brazil se miseria, a reasonably narrow set of programs. But if we look at wider social policy, there's of course still more to do. I'm still sticking really to social protection policy, not even health or education. But when I think about that, the first thing I always check for in any country is the early childhood development, because if there is a magic bullet in development, we now have not only the economic and social sciences, but the biological sciences to know that it's early childhood development. So it's always important to check and see how that's doing first. Brazil has, as the minister said, essentially conquered chronic malnutrition, and it did it much earlier than other countries. I was looking up some quotable factoids for the presentation, and was really taken aback, not just at finding the facts, but at how each of the different studies I turned up, there was always a little box that said, okay, so, you know, malnutrition is terrible in Bangladesh or Guatemala or wherever it's reprimanding. And then there's a box that says, and how do you do it? And there's the Brazil experience. So it's always one of the example countries. Now with Brazil Carinhoso, you've added the next dimension of childhood development in the early stimulation front. But as you work on the coverage challenge, it's going to be very important to work on the quality challenge, because it's not really just having kids in a place that matters. It's what happens to them when they're there. And this parallels the challenge on more general education, that the coverage challenge is moving very well, but the quality challenge is a hard one and will stay with you. So I just want to say that this is a dimension where you're working, and I am very happy to see you working there, but it is one that cannot be taken for granted because it is such a hard one. I also wanted to mention the social work services. I think this is a piece of the Bolsa Familia, or now Brasil se miseria experience, that's not so well known around the world, and I think it deserves to be. It's still a relatively small number of your total beneficiaries, but the impact evaluations of showing what that kind of family accompaniment can do are coming out very positively. And it's a model that a few other countries are beginning to experiment with. And everything we're learning now in behavioral economics tells us that this is important. And so I think consolidating that experience and disseminating that is also of interest. There's much more that could be said on the labor market side and the job side, but I think that will come up tomorrow, so I'm not going to say anything there. I put the pensions here because they're such an important part of the social contract, and yet they're a difficult one. So we know that Brazil has a very generous pension system, so that already you're spending on pensions twice what a country equally aged would spend, and demographic pressures are going to raise that. So in 2000, the year 2000, you had 5% of the population that was over 65. That'll be 23% in 2050. And the projections are that if the programs stay as they are, within about 50 years, the amount spent on pensions would go from 7 to 16% of GDP. So that's big. Obviously, there probably will be changes between now and then, but the notion that there are pressures in the system that may work to put pressure on the kinds of programs we've been talking about today is there. So keeping that balance going over the years, I think, is going to be an important challenge for you. So when I think about the challenges, I go back to, they're not really something different. They're really working on the next steps of many of the same frontiers you've been working on. So then the question arises, how do you sell that? You know, I mean, we have some new bosses in the bank, so they're asking me questions like, these CCT things, they're over, right? So, like, you know, we can quit now? And telling them, no, we can't quit. We're not done. There's still more to do in that agenda itself and in the wider social protection thing is difficult. To get somebody excited about saying, and now we need the equivalent of Cadastro 8 or 9, how do you sell that idea? So I wondered, how do you sell that idea? And I realized that what Brazil has done so far may serve it in the future. There we go. In the sense of both these programs, I think, have been very good at connecting to the goals of wide society. You've defined specific areas of action and targets, been very consistent in direction, very persistent in effort, but also very innovative. And finally, you've shown results. So I think these are things that you have done in the past, and I hope that they will hold you well in the future so that we can continue to witness and partner in the development of Brazilian social policy. Thank you.